Hi, this is U.S. History according to Mrs. Fournier, brought to you by History in Review. I want to talk to you about the word compromise. Compromise comes from the Latin compromissum. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means mutual promise. So, U.S. history, well, it's not my story to tell, but whose history is it? There are many perspectives of how the story of the founding of the U.S. is told. As an eighth grade U.S. history teacher, I had difficulty presenting history as it was written in the books to my diverse group of students that were sitting in the seats of our classrooms. Is it a heroic story? Oh, well, that depends on which side you stand. What is evident is that while our founding was based on solid principles, there were actually cracks in the foundation, because much of the decision making was based on power, politics, and property, and it wasn't always necessarily centered on all people. So I used to teach the heroic and the patriotic story of the foundations of the United States of America, and I love these stories. We review how we established the colonies, and King George's demands caused such oppression that we just had to fight back. The Boston Massacre, which wasn't a riot, happened because the redcoats were shooting at this innocent crowd. And then we did the Boston Tea Party. That wasn't a riot. That was a patriotic snub at those Brits. And one lesson, social studies teachers, we pretend to find a breakup note on the floor that is actually pretended to be passed between two eighth graders. And then the students soon realize it's the USA breaking up with England, which was also better known as the Declaration of Independence. And we really celebrate the boldness of Thomas Jefferson's words. I love those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh, gives me chills. We also used to teach about the Articles of Confederation, which I always called it our rough draft or our first draft of government. This was the document that we created right after we got our independence, and it was going to be great state control because we didn't want the federal government oppressing us with one leader. And then all of a sudden, very shortly thereafter, a farmer named Shays starts this rebellion. He had actually fought in the revolution, and he's like, hold on, you're not taxing me, my farmer friends and I, you're not going to tax us. So he started a rebellion, not a riot. And what was that rebellion / not a riot? They took up guns and they blocked people from entering a courthouse, and they attempted to break into an arsenal, which was a place that stored guns, as a revolt. Again, that wasn't a riot. And so the founders went back to the drawing board, and frankly, James Madison was preparing for this, and they decided we need to establish a new government. That one didn't work. So, and by everyone, I mean it was 55 white landowning men, about almost half of them who actually were slave owners. James Madison, who was also a slave owner, had spent lots of time researching the foundations of these historic empires. And he studied the demise of those countries. And he came up with this great idea to keep a balance in this new country. And so at the Constitutional Convention, he proposed this three-way system of checks and balances. And nobody in this system was going to be more powerful than anybody else. Genius. So the founders carefully decided that congressmen are elected every 2 years, presidents every 4 years, senators every 6 years. This is just ridiculously smart. So the voters could make changes if things felt off balance at any point. And then the Supreme Court justices were appointed to lifetime positions, which keeps them free politically, so they're not partisan in any way when they're making their decisions. Anyway, so we move on to the Constitutional Convention. This was the beginning of this word compromise, that was established by men who chose to come to an agreement in order to move our country forward. Well, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines compromise as coming to agreement by mutual concession. And that's true, but those mutually agreeing were, again, these white landowning men. Not everybody's voice was at the table for this mutual agreement. And they were making decisions that negatively impacted Black people again and again and again. In fact, my hypothesis is the word compromise in US history. If you hear that word, it usually translates to something bad is going to happen to Black people. Let's see if this is true or not. So we've got the Great Compromise, which happens at the Constitutional Convention, and it's proposed by Connecticut Representative Roger Sherman, who coincidentally is the first cousin 9 times removed by our 43rd president, George W. Bush. So he comes up with this idea. He says, listen, what if we have 2 houses? What if one represents the population of the state? Second is just 2 people from every state, regardless of size or population. And then the House of Representatives plus the Senate makes one body called Congress. Genius again, so smart. We're still doing that today. And then all of a sudden somebody's like, well, hey, hold on a second. How do you count the population of slave states? And slave owners, who originally called slaves their property, decided at this moment that slaves were now people. And the Northerners were saying that slaves were property. And herein lies the crack in the foundation of our democracy. Again, we go back to power, property, and politics, not about all the people. So you've got the non-slave owning men, who were mostly from the North, arguing that there should be a compromise. If the slaves were being counted as people, then shouldn't they also be counted as property to tax? So again, the Northerners are arguing for slaves to be property so that the federal government can have more money. And the Southerners want the slaves to be counted as people so they can have more political power in the House of Representatives. So they flip-flop their positions. And again, it was about what? Money and power. And where was the voice of the slave? Nowhere. So without counting slaves as people, the South would have about 39% representation in Congress. And by counting 3/5 of the slaves, which is where this compromise comes in, the South now had 45% representation, which made a big difference when you're protecting the industry of slavery. And so begins the building of our country on this broken foundation. We use the word compromise to be polite. It's like we were a family that knows that a relative's behavior is wrong, but we choose to just all get along because we're not going to call out that bad behavior. We just want to keep peace among the family. But hold on, this was way more than bad behavior. This was the enslavement of humans. This was shackling humans, transporting them on boats for months to live in bondage in a free country. The irony is ridiculously thick. We chose not to do the hard work at that table at the Constitutional Convention. Men like Ben Franklin, who was a former slave owner who turned abolitionist. He was advocating to get rid of slavery. He chose at the convention to agree to disagree so that they could keep going. And shortly after, our country then starts expanding westward. Thomas Jefferson's president, a slave owner, he brokered the Louisiana Purchase with France, and we doubled in size. He said to Lewis and Clark, go, explore. And then we had the Indian Removal Act, the Alamo, the Mexican-American War, the gold rush in California, and suddenly we became one huge country. Manifest destiny. It was our justifiable right and duty to expand our land. So during this huge expansion, many issues arose. Would new states enter the Union? Were they going to be slave states or would they be free states? And who decides that? The federal government or the state itself? In 1820, a new compromise is formed when Missouri petitions to become a state. They decide all states entering the Union north of the southern border of Missouri would be free states, and all states entering below it would be slave states. In order to keep the balance of the number of members in the Senate, Maine entered as a free state and Missouri entered as a slave state. And again, the foundation cracks a little bit more. Again, it's not about people, it's about money and political power. No one was willing to actually confront slavery because it was now spiraling beyond imagination. The USA, both North and South, was making huge profits from the industry of slavery. Textile mills were popping up everywhere. The North was using cotton that was produced in the South. Everybody was making a lot of money except the slaves. The invention of the cotton gin changed the landscape of slavery. Before, there were about 700,000 slaves in America, but by the time the Civil War started in 1860, there were almost 4 million slaves. 4 million. Another issue that arises is California now petitions to enter the Union as a free state. So they come up with a new compromise called the Compromise of 1850. There's a lot of parts to this agreement, but one is that the Northerners are now required by law to report any fugitive slaves who are living in the North, and the Northerners are upset about this mandated civic duty, and many refuse to report to authorities. So the Fugitive Slave Act requires the Northerners to assist in the apprehension of runaway slaves because the federal government doesn't condone slaves running away and seeking freedom. The tension between the North and the South continues to build. Now you have citizens refusing to follow the law in the North, and the Underground Railroad becomes much more active. And that crack in the foundation gets bigger. So then by the time the Civil War starts, there are about 27 million white people and over 4 million slaves. Slaves make up about 15% of the total population, keeping in mind they did not come here by choice. 620,000 Americans die in that war. 260,000 of the men who died were not actually Americans at the time of the war. They were Confederates fighting for the country that they had formed in order to maintain slavery in the South. So then we have the Reconstruction era happens after that as a result of the North winning the war. Re meaning again, and construction meant to build. And the intent of Reconstruction was to finally have an equal starting line for everybody. Just a side note, the Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. The Ku Klux Klan started 8 months later on Christmas Eve of 1865. Finally, we have the Compromise of 1877, which is part of the Reconstruction. Hayes-Tilden Compromise ultimately states that federal troops in the South are now removed, and it allows the Southerners to take over once again. So much for constructing and trying to rebuild this thing called democracy again. Instead, Jim Crow laws begin shortly thereafter, black codes, and it's another example of this polite family not wanting to confront the issues. Whites and blacks were separate, but very, very unequal. Another huge crack in the foundation. These compromises didn't move the country forward. They kicked the can down the road. Playing nice in order to ratify the Constitution did so much damage. The founding, quote, fathers, they did. They researched, studied, they debated how to form the best government, a new government, a government ensured to checks and balances, a government ensuring no one person could have ultimate power and authority, a government that would never again allow for tyrannical rule. These men wrote a constitution. They detailed what freedom means. They created a Bill of Rights telling us what that freedom was. And they allowed us to edit that document as time went on because they knew that our society would change, it would grow, it would evolve. They called it a more perfect union, not that it was perfect. They didn't address the issue of slavery directly. We never have. Flash forward today, it's time for a family intervention. It's time for us to examine the cracks in our foundation. The burden, the compromise, should not be on the Black person's shoulder. In fact, it never should have been. The burden of compromise should be on all of our shoulders. We need to fix this. We need to get back to the foundation. We have to fortify it so all of us can live free. All people are created equal. All people should have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's time for Congress in the United States of America to create an official compromise that actually lives up to the word itself. We should be focusing on the pro part of the word compromise, which actually means in favor of. We need a mutual promise that's in favor of Black people in this country who have been abused by these compromises for way too long.